And we left off here. We were talking about the founder effect with regard to, and you can see the image where you have a certain percentage with regard to the allele, certainly skewed toward the blue marbles as opposed to the white. And that does not represent the larger population it came from. The larger population was more 50-50 blue and yellow marbles. So that founder effect can then lead to a population that is eventually very different than the population it came from, because the genetic pool now has been shifted toward whatever those blue marbles brought with it. And then the other thing is this bottleneck effect, where you see you have just a small portion of the original large population is allowed to reproduce, is allowed to create the new population. So the bottle effect, there's a sudden reduction in population size, and generally this is due to something that happens in the environment. It usually is something catastrophic that can happen in the environment, and then that results in a gene pool that no longer reflects what the original gene pool was. And each of these can be very positive, or they can be devastatingly negative. So these effects can be positive, but they tend to be very negative. But we do find, like I said, with regard to the Galapagos, that was definitely the founder effect, where just certain species made it to the Galapagos Islands. And we do see these two, well, particularly the founder effects, we see this on island populations quite a bit. If the population remains small, then you're going to have further effects of genetic drift. So you're going to have further effects with regard to the gene pool. The variety of the gene pool might become more and might become smaller and smaller and smaller. A small variety in gene pool is generally not a good thing, because you don't have that capacity for adaptability. An example of both of these two types of concepts, a severe loss of habitat. There used to be a great prairie chicken. This prairie chicken used to have a range in the state of Illinois that pretty much covered the entire state. And now the range is just two small little green dots. You can barely see them. You have to look really close to see what the range is. And what that did, of course, is greatly reduce their population. But the effects of that is the reduction in genetic variation that caused them to be not as viable, or as viable reproductively, because only 50% of their eggs hatched. And what happened is researchers looked at DNA from specimens in museums and compared it to the variation of the population that was presently living in the 90s, and they found that there was a huge loss of alleles. And so they then introduced prairie chickens from other states, and then that increased the hatching rate of the eggs to about 90%. So this loss of genetic variation generally leads to populations that are not viable in terms of reproducing. And if that's the case, then those populations are going to die out. Gene flow, we talked about this a little bit, but that's the movement of alleles among populations. And this can be a good or bad thing. As I said, it tends to reduce variation among populations. And anytime you have a reduction of variation, you reduce the gene fitness, so the fitness for the environment. And then natural selection needs to come back in and selects for alleles that increase fitness, if possible. If not, then unfortunately, if that gene flow is reducing the fitness to the environment, and the environment keeps becoming more inhabitable for that population will die out. Evolution by natural selection does involve a couple of things. Involves sorting. New variations happen by chance. And actually, this picture has nothing to do with what I'm saying, but it's an awfully pretty picture. I think particularly this time of year, when you're waiting for the blossoms. But you do have this sorting, and that sorting is favored by natural selection, and only natural selection results in adaptive evolution. And so it really is very, very simple. Only those that are most likely to reproduce and reproduce in the greatest numbers are going to be able to pass on their genetic information and henceforth contribute to evolution. And that reproductive success, and again, that's the sorting part, but reproductive success isn't based on just one thing. It's very subtle, and it can be based on some factors that we can see, but it can also be based on other factors in terms of whether somebody is successfully reproductively. And what we mean is the gametes are able to get together. The gametes produce a viable fetus. Fetus then is raised to adulthood. So that's what we're talking about. Success reproduction is not only the creation of a new individual, but that individual then can actually reproduce also. Selection favors certain genotypes, and that then manifests in phenotypes. So 3 modes of selection with regard to reproduction. You have directional selection, disruptive selection, and then stabilizing selection. Directional selection, you see the mice, you see the original population. You have a gradation of fur color from kind of light tan to dark brown. The directional will be, again, the environment is changing. So maybe that dark brown one has the darker color has an advantage with regard to the environment, so they will be more likely to produce offspring. So that evolution will be toward the dark fur. Then you have diversifying selection, where you have something, maybe you have 2 environments. You have an environment that is conducive to the light brown mouse and the brown mouse, but not the colors in between. The colors in between, maybe they're being picked up by some cats or something. I'm just using that as an example. It has to be something more bigger than that. And then you have a stabilizing selection, where actually the middle color or the blending of the 2 extremes is the most adaptable. And so you have 3 ways that this can happen, these modes of selection. And then you also have certain adaptations that are just striking. And one of them is the fact that snakes have developed jaws with ligaments, so they can swallow prey that are much larger than their heads. And we see this in snakes. We also see it in cuttlefish that can rapidly change color to camouflage, which is really interesting because most things can't happen that quickly. The idea of natural selection increases frequency of alleles that are adaptable for survival and reproduction. And that, again, kind of repeating what we're saying, but that adaptive evolution happens because there's a match between the organism and its environment. The environment is constantly changing, or it can change. The environment can change subtly over time, or the environment can be quite quick, depending. Certainly we have seen environments that humans have acted upon that have caused the environment of species to change quite quick. It's a continuous process. Genetic drift and gene flow do not consistently lead to adaptive evolution. they have a possibility of increasing it or decreasing it. It's this natural selection, the match between the organism and its environment, that causes the evolution to take place due to the fact that those are the organisms that are going to reproduce. In terms of sexual selection, a couple of things to say about it. Because we have a male and female gamete, and male and females need to get together, sexual selection is a natural selection for mating success. It can result in sexual dimorphism, so it can result in marked differences between the sexes and between secondary sexual characteristics particularly. And what that does with regard to sexual selection is that can then lead to genetic adaptations that seem kind of wildly not logical to us, and that's why I have this picture of this peacock, which comes from your textbook. But this display of the tail of the peacock is only for one purpose, and that's to attract a mate. To attract the females. It isn't for anything else other than to attract the female. And so what you have are the more and more outlandish the tails become, the more likely that particular male peacock is going to reproduce, henceforth pass on his genetic information. The tail may be counterproductive to that peacock actually staying alive, and sometimes we see this in nature where we have these males, particularly the males who fight each other for the females. Those behaviors aren't necessarily conducive to them staying alive, but the trade-off is worth it, is if it attracts a female and the genetic information from that male is passed on, then it's worth that trade-off. You have intrasexual selection, which is competition among individuals of one sex. And again, we talk about males fighting for dominance, etc. In terms of, I'm thinking of the bighorn sheep, or I'm thinking of maybe lions, etc. And then intersexual selection, where usually the females are choosy when selecting their mates. And so again, this showiness in the males is a positive payoff for the males because the females tend to choose them. Neutral variation also is a genetic variation that doesn't necessarily confer selective or doesn't confer advantage or disadvantage. But there are mechanisms that preserve variation, and that's the fact that we have two chromosomes, so we're diploid. Diploid variation with the dominant and recessive alleles help to maintain genetic variation. And so we do find that those species that are diploid, 2N, two copies of each chromosome, tend to be more adaptable to their environments. Balancing selection occurs when natural selection maintains stable frequencies of two or more phenotypic forms in a population. So that, going back to the mice, that you have this variety of fur color, because if the environment suddenly changes, you still have those mice that are adaptable to that particular environment. That is part of the heterozygote advantage, and the heterozygote advantage occurs when it occurs, it has higher fitness than homozygotes. So the more variety you have, the more likely you're going to have somebody in that species that's going to live. And we'll pick this up on the next one.